the fourth session today. Two speakers again. First speaker, Roland Faber, Professor of Process Theology, Claremont School of Theology. Professor of Religion. It's not on. Roland Faber. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, so our first speaker, Roland Faber, Professor of Process Theology, Claremont School of Theology, Professor of Religion at the Claremont Graduate School, co-director of Center for Process Studies, and executive director of the Whitehead Research Project. Today's talk, the democracy of fellow creatures, Ontology and the problem of slavery in Whitehead and Deleuze.
I have actually, I think, already thanked the organizers, so I can't do the same thing you did in the beginning, and I have to exclude myself. So the only gift I can give you is, as we have heard in the morning, I make it harder for you to stay alive for the next half hour, to not get asleep. That's I try to talk about, especially Whitehead and Deleuze, in the connection of the themes we have raised here, ontology and politics, and the problem, how to relate them, and are they related or not. And I was looking for a grain where that is kind of coming together, and this grain I found within the problem of slavery. I'm not talking about slavery as such, which is an incredibly complicated thing and has to have a lot of analysis that goes beyond philosophy, I think. But I'm talking about the problem as it arises in these philosophies, especially beginning with Whitehead and then fading in Deleuze, as it arises as a grain that kind of structures there, for a moment at least, this relationship in a very odd way between ontology and politics, as I see it. I want to begin with an interesting, I think, connects to what we have talked about earlier, which is about that principle of reason. I think in Whitehead we find something like a widening, like an expansion of that principle. He calls that coherence. And it's interesting to see that when he talks about coherence, which seems to be that what is kind of the rational here, that what allows us to analyze things, that this kind of rational or coherent is actually not really coherent. One of the points of his coherence is to say that everything it's said within coherence would presuppose the other, which is itself a problematic thing, whether that can happen. And the problem, I think he tries hard through all of his works, is to find a way to say that there is, everything I say is presupposed by everything else I want to say, but it's never really working out. So it has to be all the time we work. It's always becoming through saying that it is not a fixed thing. The second thing he's saying about coherence is that although things might be presupposed by one another, they are not derived from another, which is another point. It's kind of exploding what coherence means if they're not derived from one another, but still presupposing one another. Where are they coming in? So it's already about that opening of the notion of reason, if you want to, a kind of novelty, which can only be filled through his other side of what he will talk about in his philosophy, especially later on. It makes that clear in Process and Reality, namely it's about experiment, it's about experience, and from this side novelty comes in. It cannot be reason before that comes in. So you have kind of opening from both sides, you have kind of that kind of coherence that presupposes one another but cannot be closed at any point. And I think that is where that relationship between ontology and politics somehow arises in Whitehead, and it is kind of filled in a kind of connects that never can be brought to a kind of structure. It's always opening again. I will situate my talk around 3 or 4 or 5 quotes, more or less, and they are where I think that kind of relationship will pop up. The first one is, and it's kind of amazing for me, it was amazing for me to read that again and see it just right there, how central it became for Whitehead at a certain point. In the Benches of Ideas, when Whitehead was talking about the vast difference between ancient and modern political theories, and states that we differ from the ancients under one premise, on which they were all agreed. Slavery was the presupposition of political theorists then. And he adds, freedom is the presupposition of political theorists now. So it's really about that point of slavery. That's really the point where it comes down. And the interesting point here is that he recognizes that it seems to be a dualism between that time and this time, a kind of period that it's not that easy, that it is actually a very complicated set of presuppositions that are not undisputed at any time. So slavery isn't undisputed and freedom is not undisputed, and they are kind of presupposing in a certain sense one another at all times with certain different effects in different cultures. Now, Whitehead mentions further that the chief factor in producing this divide between that slavery as presupposition for all and freedom is actually not any theory, it's not any thought, it's not something that can be reckoned with in a sense, but it is a revolutionary process. He says the chief factor is the skeptical humanitarian movement in the 18th century, of which Voltaire and Rousseau were among the chief exponents, with the French Revolution as culmination. He's talking about the event of this revolution as being actually a deciding factor, not something that can be reckoned with, although it can, in a sense, you can see retrospectively how it came up. You can kind of reckon with this, with it as happening. But while Whitehead is figuring that it is about revolutionary ideas, that in the end kind of brought up a culminative effect that made it possible to overcome slavery as a basic presupposition, at least as that, not as a practice, but as a basic presupposition. He also says there has to be at the same time a metaphysical discussion, a relevant metaphysical discussion, because otherwise the controversies would be superficial, would be stay on sociologically, it would stay on the surface. And he calls that we have to talk about some more fundamental determinations. And it's nice to see in Whitehead when he uses some terms, they are undefined or they are defined, even if they are defined, they are movable. They're kind of, in a sense, not clearly defined, which allows him to kind of be that avoiding that kind of structure which is fixed, in which something that is said. So when he talks about the more fundamental determinations, what he's talking about. And he's talking about actually what I would call a deconstruction of implicit abstractions. He names that the limitations, it's about talking about the limitations within which our intuitions are hedged. So it's about talking about making clear, making open, deconstruct the limitations in which we think. Like slavery is such a limitation as it is in nature, which is a precondition of our thought. And this deconstructing of the undiscovered limitations, as he calls it, is actually then Whitehead's question of ontology. So his question of ontology, as is true for Deleuze, is not a question of being of beings, although that rhetoric can pop up, as it does in Deleuze actually, at certain points. It's not about the interrelationships of beings insofar as they are, but it's about becoming, or the conditions of becoming, which is also conditions of novelty, conditions to expand on or explode or unfold, different ways to put that, these kind of limitations in which our intuitions are hedged. So it's actually not in his ontology about, if it's about becoming, it's not about seeking the interpretation. It's not about seeking the interpretation of slavery. So how can we interpret that fact? It's not about that, but it is about an understanding that is already the outcome, always, of a creative synthesis of novelty beyond any state. So whenever you try to interpret something, you have gone beyond that state to the good or the bad, in a certain way, revolutionary or not. It is about the event, actually. That goes beyond interpretation. Interpretation becomes only a retrospective way to analyze something. I see at least three metaphysical complications, and I use a single term like you, it's complicities, complications in that move of Whitehead's. And I want to put it in these terms. First one is, it seems to be that metaphysical principles in Whitehead exhibit a kind of distributive arbitrariness. They are not fixed principles. So what can never be found in Whitehead is ontological reasons out of a state of things, a fixed thing. we always, he says, find only historical reasons for their pattern. So every pattern, in fact, has only reasons that cannot be grounded in an ontological structure which is already there, from which we just derive them. This is actually Whitehead's ontological principle. So it's about ontology, but I always was curious, why did he call what he called ontological principle an ontological principle? Because it's precisely not an ontological principle. In the sense, it's not giving something, it's not revealing a being of beings in the background, a ground of grounding, whatever. It's precisely the opposite of it. He calls it, he names it, and as you know, he changed his term from event to actual entities and used event for a combination of actual entities. But if you want to stay in that kind of open texture, you can say what he said was that actual entities, so what he calls an ontological principle, or is that actual entities are the only reasons. So to search for a reason is to search for one or more actual entities. To search for a reason is to search for events. The interesting point here is it's about reasons, it's not necessarily about causes. This is quite similar to Deleuze's differentiation coming out of a totally different context with his Stoic background of effects and causes. But it is something, at least it is something that cannot be brought back to a substructure, a ground in which it's grounded. It's precisely prohibiting that there is something like that. It's always going back to, if you want, historical reasons or reasons of becoming of something, which has at a certain point also be differentiated, are conflated here. So the demand, what it demands, this ontological principle, is actually that political agency is always only historically determined. It's not ontologically fixated. We cannot have an ontology out of which we can say that something has to happen, it cannot be described, prescriptive, and so on. Cultural necessities have no ontological foundation. They're always going back to other cultural necessities, often, which are not foundations. So they are not just awaiting an interpretation so that we can interpret that in the sense of having a ground, but they are always already activities, they're always already events. So if you want to go back or forward, you always end or begin or in the middle of events. You never found a ground out of which you can restate that in an ontological sense. And that would be his ontological principle, which then is the basis for his approach to politics of freedom and equality, but also paradoxically, it allows them for the possibility of slavery at the same time. And I want to expand on that a little bit because that's the paradox I'm wrestling with in Whitehead and Deleuze, and the question is whether they can solve that problem, and I think ultimately they fail to do so, but there's a reason for that they fail. So that was the first point. The second point, the second complication here is Whitehead or against Hume actually, was not thinking what he says that there can be no appeal to practice to supplement metaphysics. So you can't have one metaphysics, but you can't say if it's not working, you have a practice on the other hand that you either accept or tolerate as not kind of working together with it, or that you always invoke to make interpretations work. But he says, and this is the point where he wants to go, or where he actually admires Hume, that the final appeal to practice is an appeal against the adequacy of metaphysical categories as interpretive of experience. So that the metaphysical categories actually are changing because of the practice. Because of the event, you change, the principles changing. They are not basic principles already fixed there with which you either interpret experience or practice, or you say, well, it's a practice, but the actual grounding, I might not find a way to say that, how it's grounded, but it's still my principle. So there's a kind of empiricism there in Whitehead that does not interpret the practice in a sense that it then relates to a certain ontology, but if you want to go with a big word here, because he invited us to think about that, the French Revolution, he thinks revolution. So revolutionary praxis might precisely, might be understood precisely as the praxis that cannot be based on any ontology. Maybe you can even say each revolution creates its own ontology to its own disadvantagement, actually, then. This implies also that thinking of revolution demands also the analysis of an ontology in place, a so-called interpretation that allows a practice to happen and to be justified. So it is like, if you want, Judith Butler, that in Whitehead we find a radical criticism of substantialism as a criticism, as a deconstructive criticism of the reinterpretive enforcement of an ontology that justifies a practice such as slavery. It's a deconstruction of these kind of certifications. And the third one, very shortly, in a sense, for Whitehead, ontology and politics are mutually untimely. I use a term that's not used by Whitehead here, but by Deleuze, meaning that they are either in their past or future of any given state to one another. They are not working together to become a communal presence in which they just nicely work together and you can move from one to the other. They're never working together, actually, and that's precisely the point. And they're becoming a presence for one another. Now, these three complications of mutual, if you want, this kind of interface, a mutual resonance of ontology and politics, which is not a resonance, it's not just a positive resonance, it's kind of one that also strikes one strikes the other here, makes or renders feasible the paradox of democracy, as he mentions. The paradox is that it, on the one hand, might have been indeed the seed for overcoming slavery, so the seed for overcoming, but at the same time made it possible and lived on the possibility and on the reality of slavery. He calls it, everyone in Athens, he means, going back to where it comes from, accepted slavery as a matter of course. It was presupposed in the very structure of society, and such necessity limits the scope of all generalities. So what he's saying actually, that whenever we want to have an ontology of democracy, which is a nice multiplicity and everyone has a voice and we can talk to one another, it's only said because we have excluded already the slaves on which it is built. And that's what he is mentioning here. What it does is we think it's a universal thing, so we have a universal democracy, the idea of a universal democracy, everyone should be in a democracy, right? But it is already said in a context in which we have excluded, or we are hedged in our intuitions already within this limits of the scope of generalities. So the limit is given by slavery already. So if you go out and want to say, I want everyone to be in a democracy and we install a democracy, that's the point, that's the problem. You do precisely that. Yeah. You repeat that problem of building it again on a basis of slavery. For Whitehead, actually he mentions that there are two events in Greece that kind of conspired to that democracy as a seed for overcoming slavery. And one of it, and again, both are based already again on the slavery that happened. One for him is Pericles' speech, which allows everyone to talk freely in a society, kind of creating a public space of free talk. And free talk was not only talk, it was meant as political action at that point, or activity at that time. And secondly, Plato's deeper notions, he says, from which all claims for freedom must spring, namely the psychic factors in the universe stressed as the source of all spontaneity. And as we might know or realize, these psychic factors of spontaneity are not meaning just an internal existing reality. So we kind of beginning 20th century or middle 9th century, because we have a totalitarian state, we have an internal psychic state in which we go back and we have our living room where we can be free, but outside we have to be very careful what we do. Situation that comes back today, I think, in a certain sense. But it is a political notion. It means that internally makes you able to be politically active outside you. It's a kind of political, public movement. It's not just an internal movement. In the wake of these events, he says there are essential elements of civilizations that can only maintain free society, and the disturbing thing of it is that what he mentions as that essential element in civilization is, he calls it the sense of the variousness of the universe, not to be fathomed by our intellects, which sounds that it goes beyond the principle of reason. It cannot be fathomed ever, but it is the variousness that goes beyond. It's that blurredness, variousness that is a kind of multiplicity that cannot be pinned down to elements of unity or whatever. And this, if you want, ontological structure of spontaneous multiplicity then demands, he calls it this way, the duty of tolerance that is our finite homage to the abundance of inexhaustible novelty which is awaiting the future. So at the same time, inexhaustible novelty which cannot ever be fathomed with. Which is precisely the context in which all these hedged intuitions, these limitations are seen, but we never reach that point where we come to that infinity as a positive thing, where we kind of utter. This is also then the problem with democracy actually ever being without that problem of slavery. One of Whitehead's consequences is that, or is radical in a sense, or was for him a radical thing to say, is if you want, you can say it's constructivism. It says that laws, whatever you want to call structure, whatever you want to call reason or ground, whatever, is immanent to becoming. It's not something that's outside, something before or whatever, or over or under. It's always an outcome of becoming. And therefore, what he says about it is that it is just a communal custom. So any law of any kind, and be it even mathematics, and be it even laws of logic, are to a certain extent communal customs of how things run. Law is, to a certain extent, therefore, you could say it's a term that was taken up by Julie Butler, performative. The events on which they are based crack open always the hidden multiplicities. They can never be pinned down to a certain order. And I think it was mentioned by the kind of radicals in Whitehead, the entire living nexus, or the entire living occasions in freely through his society moving. But disturbing them, not just moving around. So the event ever overcreates the law as a parody, realizing that there is no natural state of given things. There's no natural state. It would be a naturalization. It's nothing that's just, again, something that we have to presuppose. Whitehead's ontological deconstruction of slavery is that of a subjection to a transcendent law, politically utilized to create, well, it's a term that's not really fitting, but to create privileges, but it's more than a privilege. You hear more than that. It's not just a nice privilege. It's really that privilege that is based on very profound subjection of people. And therefore is directed, so that central point that he directs it against is his criticism of substantialism. And he calls the rise of slavery as the installment of a barbarous substratum in society. I quoted a little bit later more, so it's kind of an outcome of his criticism of substantialism. For Whitehead, it is the same deception that led to three expressions of substantialism, and they are interrelated again. So one is ontologically, if you want, Descartes' what he calls arbitrary disconnection of two kinds of substance, corporal and mental. They were not only reducing mentality to reflection and body to empty extension, but justifying the privileges of mind over body, men over women, substance over attribute. Epistemologically, it leads to the bifurcation of nature by the isolation of entities from the web of interrelations of nature, reducing the fundamental character of nature, what he calls the metaphysical substratum of his properties. So it makes that kind of interconnection of events to a passive material substratum of which these events become properties. That's the substantialization process, and precisely that is what he says about the political complex, the third one, namely that slavery, the installation, what he calls, quote, the barbarous substratum interwoven in the social structure so as to sustain the civilized epics. It's also the creation of that substratum, of which then the subjects of it become properties. So one of the consequences of this analysis is that we have to get rid of that notion of property in his essentials. When he calls Aristotle the one who was the apostle of substance and attribute, that installed a kind of classificatory logic of hierarchies of then what we later would call binaries or privileging binaries, hierarchies that are already in place, which led to the justification, also in Aristotle, of slavery on the basis of the understanding that slaves are properties of substances, namely the free citizen. If slavery is the reduction of human beings to private property or economic asset, the reduction of self-creative agency to passive particles of matter, then it is based on this substantialist disconnection. I want to end here the Whitehead passage. How much time do you have? So, wow. Okay. Well, it happens not just to you, right? I mentioned, so I skip forward, but I will mention one quote of Whitehead which kind of mentions his kind of alternative view to substantialize and then propertize things, and mentions where he wants to go. Quote: "When philosophy hinges around the difficulty of describing the world in terms of subject and predicate, substance and quality, particular and universal, that result is always violence to that immediate experience which we express in our actions, our hopes, our sympathies, and our purposes, whereby we find ourselves in a buzzing world, I mean the democracy of fellow creatures," that's the quote I put on the front, "whereas under some disguise or other, orthodox philosophy can only introduce us to solitary substances." I'm going to skip to Deleuze, and since I have only 4 minutes left or something like this, let me just mention two things which makes it kind of interesting how he connects to it. One is that he also goes back at a certain point in his dialogues to Hume to make that difference between an ontology which is an ontology, which is no ontology, like Whitehead's ontological principle, and he calls the one the ontology of the is, and the other one of the end. End, which is A-N-D, always in capitalized, in the sense that it's always the kind of addition that cannot be reckoned with, and it can only come out of the is, while this ontology of the is precisely where that substantialism kicks in the end it does not. It is now interesting, I have to skip Nietzsche here, and I have to skip Spinoza here, well, just on the side. They all make analysis of these, or both make analysis of Spinoza, for instance, to come to this point. And it's interesting, and I want to end with that, so that most of the best things are not said, as everyone else says. There's a lecture of Spinoza in Versailles, December 12th, 1980, and it is on Spinoza, and he is talking about precisely our question. He asked the question, in what sense can ontology entail, or must it entail, a political philosophy? Wow, he's actually asking that question. Right? And he rephrases it at a certain point with Spinoza asking that question that the others have already raised, namely not to understand just slavery, but to understand how it is possible that people fight for the slavery. Right? Being in that situation is proposed and propelled all the time. And he answers with a fundamental, he calls it a fundamental relation between ontology and a certain style of politics. And he wants to differentiate that. If you situate, he says, a political philosophy in an ontology, then he would differentiate between what he calls pure ontologies and philosophies of the one. So we are back with the one, that's really the point. So let me end with that quote, which makes clear in which situation he situates himself here. Then maybe one sentence more. The quote is, "Philosophies of the one are philosophies that fundamentally imply a hierarchy of existing things. The problem of the state they will encounter is the institution of a political hierarchy. What appears to me striking in a pure ontology is the point at which it repudiates the hierarchies. In effect, if there is no one superior to being, being is said of everything, and that is, and is said of everything that is in one and the same sense." Here, the criticism of Badiou kicks in that the one is still kind of present, it's the kind of enfoldment of the one. "This world," he goes on to say, "of ontological immanence is an essential anti-hierarchical world. It is almost a kind of anarchy," and he uses the term in the original sense that you have no order out of which it it comes. There is an anarchy of beings in being. Thereby, the political domain depends precisely on this kind of intuition of equal being, of anti-hierarchical being. Now, as I go on to explain later on, they try to, both Whitehead and Deleuze, I think they try to make a point that how can it be that you are saying there is that kind of ontological statement, which is not really an ontological statement, that allows you to go in the direction of democracy, that's what Deleuze says, goes in the direction of anti-hierarchical, which opens up that possibility. At the same time, how do you explain that slavery at the same time happens? And why can it be that slavery is all the time, at the same time, the basis, the excluded of that happening? And I think ultimately, with all the strategies they use for becoming multiple, becoming democratic or becoming minor, in a certain sense they fail to reach that point in which you can exclude precisely that duality. What the interesting thing for me is, at the end, is that when he tries, for instance, with the body, with the organs, it's precisely that cannot happen. It's a limit that you never reach. So it's precisely whenever you try, you become a totalizing movement, which is really the date of that what you tried. That's the kind of the tragedy of that. And I think, understand, therefore, why Whitehead in Adventures of Ideas later on always talks about that tragedy that is in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. Our second speaker is Henry Krips, Professor of Cultural Studies, and the Andrew W. Mellon, all Claremont Chair of Humanities at Claremont Graduate University. The talk, The Politics of Badiou, from Absolute Singularity to Objet-a.
If you don't mind, I'll sit down. I have this prospect of the taller members of the speaking fraternity here bending over painfully the rather short. So I'm going to try sitting down, and hopefully you will hear me with no trouble. I've certainly had no complaints over that my voice is not loud enough. So the question which I want to address is, for Badiou, what is an event? Specifically, what is a political event? Badiou famously offers the example of the French Revolution. He starts by considering how one of his bugbears, the professional historian, would approach this event. And I quote, "The historian ends up including in the event of the French Revolution everything delivered by the epoch as traces and facts. The electors of the General Estates, the peasants of the Great Fear, the sans-culottes, the soldiers of the draft, but also the price of subsistence, the guillotine, the effects of the tribunal, and so on. But this archival approach, Badiou says, may well lead to the unity of the event, being undone, swamped by the forever infinite and endless numbering of the gestures, things, and words that coexisted with it. Badiou then affirms that the French Revolution deserves to be singled out as a proper event only insofar as there exists, and I quote again, a halting point for this potentially infinite dissemination. Specifically, an event is constituted through what Badiou calls an interpretive intervention, by which the conscience of the times and the retroactive intervention of our own time filters the entire site through the one unifying principle of its evental qualification. So the question is, what form does this interpretive intervention take? According to Badiou, it involves discerning a new pattern within the nexus of effects that are connected with the event. So you look to the future. Thus, the interpretive intervention operates via a sort of gestalt switch, whereby an unrecognized collection of effects, what Badiou calls an excrescence, is transformed into what he calls a normal element of the situation, which is both presented as an element in its own right, but also represented as a part. This interpretive intervention then retrospectively hypostasizes the event as the source of this new pattern of events, and I quote, "An interpretive intervention declares that an event is present in a situation as the arrival in being of non-being, the arrival amidst the visible of the invisible." So you have this image of the French Revolution, this endless dissemination of effects and facts, and into the midst of this, there is an arrival of the revolution, retrospectively in terms of a pattern which is discerned in terms of the endlessly disseminating field of effects. An element that is a sort of special sort of singularity, what Badiou calls an absolute singularity, that is distinct from the endlessly disseminating elements that the historian offers as candidates for inclusion in the revolution. More specifically, the event is like a secret heart of the revolution, which lies hidden in the midst of, but separate from, the disseminating field of facts and traces that the historian describes. Note, however, that the process of discerning a new pattern that precipitates the emergence of the event of the revolution is not merely a matter of an academic historian years later discovering what existed all along but was hidden. Instead, the process of discerning is also contemporary with the event, an action by the participants themselves, which rather than cognitive in nature, rather than just discovering, oh my God, we're on the crest of a revolution, is a militant commitment to seeing and acting upon things differently. For example, consider the way in which the light of the interpretation of the French Revolution as a revolution, consider the way in which, in the light of the interpretation of the French Revolution as a revolution, the mass of peasants who were part of the situation in France 1789 to 1790 retrospectively becomes a new entity, namely those what Badiou calls the peasants of the great fear, who seized the castles, a happening that together with other happenings such as the storming of the Bastille constitutes a diffuse and somewhat indeterminate source for the effects that are connected to the revolution as its future traces. In this case, it is clear that the relation between the event and its effects is not merely a matter of straightforward causation, but instead involves a retroactive dimension, Nachträglichkeit in exactly Freud's sense. That is, through an interpretive intervention that occurs after the fact, as it were, the event is brought into being as a point of origin for the new pattern of effects. Now, whether this is nominalism is, of course, one of the interesting questions that James Bradley's talk raised. But as I indicated, the interpretive act also takes place at the site of the event itself. For example, through the actions of the participants who, signing on to the cause under one of its many names, liberty, revolution, down with tyranny, and so on, bring it into existence. Thus, their acts in identifying with the cause take on what we may think of as a performative dimension, not merely an interpretive dimension. Furthermore, their signing on functions not merely as a cause, but also, for Badiou critically, as a part of the event, thus collapsing the distinction between saying the name and conjuring up the object, or in Lacan's terms, there is no meta-language. The language-meta-language distinction collapses. To put it in a nutshell, the act of interpretation through which the event is retrospectively brought into being itself becomes part of the event. Thus, the event is doubled. It manifests both as an absolute singularity, as well as the act of interpretation through which the event is named by those who are faithful to it. As Badiou puts it, the mark of itself belongs to the evental multiple. Badiou offers a compelling account of the event, and I've only given the briefest summary here of it. But as Oliver and Justin pointed out yesterday, there is a serious weakness in this account, namely its failure to detail the connection between an event and its material surroundings, the situation in which it appears. In the next section, I'm going to use some Lacanian concepts to address this weakness. Then in the final section, I'm going to turn finally to Badiou's concept of the political event by talking a little bit about Zizek. So, next section is called Badiou and Lacan. Badiou explores the concept of an event in a variety of contexts, including the one that I focus on here, namely Nietzsche's critique of St. Paul's account of the Christ event, namely the resurrection. According to Nietzsche, Paul insists that in order to understand the revolutionary significance of the Passion of Christ, there must be something in addition to the blunt facts of the death by crucifixion of a man, Jesus of Nazareth, even when those facts are thickened with theological meaning, namely Jesus as also the Son of God, the maker of miracles, and so on. That something in addition, Nietzsche claims, is the resurrection, with its universal invitation to have faith and thus find salvation. An invitation that is universal in the sense that it cuts across, as Badiou puts it, all social barriers, extending to Greek and to Jew alike. Nietzsche then dismisses this invitation as the big lie of the resurrection, with its phony promise of salvation. There is, says Nietzsche, nothing more to the resurrection than the crucifixion. If indeed there is even that, all the rest is a comfortable, or perhaps not so comfortable, if you happen to be Jewish as I am, not so comfortable fable. Badiou objects that Nietzsche misunderstands Paul's position. Paul, the cynical rabbi, recognized well enough that the situation of the crucifixion contained no secret, let alone mystical something in addition, which transformed the crucifixion into the resurrection, and correspondingly grounded the faith in salvation. On the contrary, the dimension of faith presupposes precisely the absence of any such grounding element. Instead, Badiou argues, the resurrection presented itself in the situation of the crucifixion as a basic element, an absolute singularity, rather than being a composite of the crucifixion together with some mystery element, some mystery secret ingredient, X. Badiou makes the point like this. But Nietzsche is not precise enough. When he writes that Paul needs Christ's death and something in addition, he should have emphasized that this something is not in addition to the death. He then goes on to say that if Paul shifted the center of gravity of Christ's existence beyond the experience of the crucifixion, then it is in accordance with a principle that because of the crucifixion, life, affirmative life, is restored and refounded for all. End of quote. How then does the resurrection come to appear as an absolute singularity, independent of, but attached to the crucifixion? Where does it come from? From the future, Badiou argues, as a retroactive effect of a process of fidelity by subjects who are defined by their faith in and faithfulness to the resurrection, along with their related hope for salvation. In short, to put it in quasi-Nietzschean terms that suits Badiou's atheism, the event of the resurrection is the result of a sort of wish fulfillment, which fastens onto the crucifixion as a fictional basis for the hope of salvation. Thus, we can see Badiou distinguishes three aspects of the Christ event. One, plain material facts of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, what Clifford Geertz would call a thin description, relatively unmediated by heavy theoretical or theological vocabulary. Two, the death on the cross of Christ, Son of God. But three, the process of fidelity to the resurrection, which constitutes it retroactively via an interpretive intervention. Badiou designates the second of these aspects, namely the death of Christ, as the absolute singularity that constitutes what he sometimes also calls the evental sight, and designates the third aspect, namely the resurrection, as the event proper. Now, Badiou has a lot to say about the relation between these latter two aspects of the event. In particular, he emphasizes that the evental sight does not determine the event. On the contrary, the event is determined by the intervention of militant subjects who bridge the gap between the evental sight and the event. Or to turn the point around, the gap between event and evental sight creates a space for the militant subject and his or her exercises of fidelity. In Althusserian terms, we may say that this gap is the ideological site of interpolation, where individuals, all of them, are called, and some of them, although not as many as 9 out of 10, Althusser's speculative figure, manage to prove themselves as true militant subjects. But Badiou has much less to say, and this is coming to my point of criticism of Badiou, much less to say about the equally important relation between the first of the above three aspects of the Christ event, namely the mundane happening of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, and the second of the aspects, namely the fictionalized death of the Christ. In particular, he offers no way of thinking why, in the biblical context, the fable of the crucifixion of the Son of God is attached to the account of a botched execution of a man, Jesus of Nazareth, that is so full of strange and gruesome details. The premature darkness, the strangely restless animals, the stumbles by the criminal on his way to execution, the unruly mob, the sympathetic soldiers, the preternaturally delayed death, and so on. I want to suggest that we think the relation between these two stories in Lacanian terms. To be specific, I suggest we think of Christ's crucifixion and the botched death of Jesus of Nazareth as two different but necessarily coexisting manifestations of the same object, of what Lacan calls the Objet-a. What is the Objet-a? According to Lacan, it is the object which, by blocking access to the object of desire, is the cause of desiring. But it's also the object of the drive, around which the subject circulates pleasurably in its failed attempts to get what it desires. According to Lacan, the Objet-a manifests in three intertwined levels or registers, which always and already coexist. First, the real, capital R real, namely the level at which the symbolic matrix falls apart. Second, the imaginary, namely the level of fantasy. And third, the symbolic, namely the level of reality as it is represented. To be specific, the Objet-a manifests at an imaginary level as a fantasy object, the secret kernel or essence that belongs to the situation more than any of its concrete elements, the secret heart of the situation. Not as something we desire, but rather as an imagined stumbling block that we must but cannot get around if we are ever to get what we want. It also manifests at the level of the symbolic, as a denizen of reality, and in particular as what Lacan describes as the little piece of shit in the corner, the waste or surplus of a situation that retains a fragile purchase on reality by being banished to the recycle bin. I always think of my computer where all my important work always seems to end up in the recycle bin. I don't avoid stepping on it once it's there, I try to get it back, but it never returns, I'm afraid. Finally, at the level of the real, the Objet-a manifests as a messy, shameful, anxiety-provoking, bizarre misfit in relation to the normative categories of the symbolic, a place where reality itself palpably stumbles and fails. In this light then, how can we think the relation between the biblical account of the death of Jesus and the theologically supercharged account of the death of Christ? I suggest that we think of the death of Christ as an objet-a in its manifestation as an imaginary fantasy object, specifically as that which points the way to what the faithful hope for and desire, namely salvation, even as it marks out the way as perilous and difficult, even impossible, more than passing through the eye of a needle, a crossing from one side of the valley of death to the other. I love this biblical language. This in turn suggests that the death of Jesus of Nazareth that the Gospels recount, namely a shameful and messy botched execution, I nearly said education. That was a Lacanian slip on Whereas the Nietzschean version of the crucifixion, a carpenter cruelly executed for his outlandish beliefs, is a manifestation of the same objet-a in the symbolic register. We are thus able to explain the coexistence of the three stories of the crucifixion as accounts of one and the same objet-a as it manifests in three different registers of the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic. This Lacanian suggestion throws light on the status of the death of Christ as an absolute singularity for Badiou. According to Lacan, the objet-a is what he calls an extimate object, by which he means that although it is intimate in the sense that it is more in the situation than the situation itself, its secret heart, it is also radically externalized, and in particular embodied a totally banal, unworthy object. If then, as I suggest, the death of Christ is an objet-a, we can see why it has, in Badiou's terms, no elements. It's because as an extimate object, its elements are externalized. In other words, it takes on the topology of the Klein bottle. Its insides are turned outside, so that it no longer contains them in the sense that they are elements that belong to it. In Badiou's terms, the death of Christ becomes an absolute singularity, an element of the situation that is basic in the sense that it has no elements of its own. In the larger version of this paper, I show how this Lacanian reworking of Badiou's analysis of the event has consequences for what he calls political events, and in particular brings Badiou's concept of politics closer to the Lacanian concept of the traversal of the fantasy and identification with the Santon. But I have neither the time nor the energy to include this here today. Instead, I want to content myself in conclusion with examining Zizek's suggestion for reworking Badiou's concept of the political along Lacanian lines. A reworking that is of interest because it represents a common misreading of Badiou. As we will see, this brings up the vexed issue of naming in Badiou, to which Oliver and Justin gestured yesterday. So, final section, the Zizekian coda, what's in a name? Zizek sticks to Badiou's early emphasis on a politics of naming. Unlike Badiou, and more like Ernesto Laclau, he hypothesizes an identity between what Badiou calls names and what Lacan calls master signifiers, point du capitaine. On this basis, Zizek proposes a politics that involves the, quotes, intervention of a master signifier that imposes a principle of ordering onto the world. The master invents a new signifier, which again stabilizes the situation and makes it readable. The master adds no new positive content, he merely adds a signifier, which all of a sudden turns disorder into order. In short, as Zizek also puts it, the task for an emancipatory politics today is to form a new world, to propose new master signifiers that would provide new cognitive mappings, end of quote. But there seems to be something perversely, even dangerously wrong with Zizek's politics here. Consider, for example, the feminist political gesture that constitutes the social category of woman. Such a gesture definitely does not depend upon the authority of a feminist master, even one who acquires her authority retrospectively. On the contrary, as many feminists would be quick to point out, a feminist master is an oxymoron, since it reproduces exactly the patriarchal structure of mastery to which feminism is opposed. How then is the feminist political gesture to be achieved, if not by an act of mastery, as Zizek would claim, undertaken from a position of authority, real or imagined? Badiou's answer to this question indicates the distance between his position and Zizek's. For Badiou, a political event must satisfy three conditions. First condition, its agents, what Badiou calls its subjects, must make an ongoing commitment to a new order. In particular, they must discern and remain faithful to a previously indiscernible pattern within the ever-expanding field of effects of the event, bringing the visible, the invisible, into the midst of the visible. In retrospect, then, the source of the newly discerned pattern of effects takes on the status of an absolutely singular element within the situation. Second condition, by cutting across the social boundaries that constrain people's activities, the new order operates according to a principle of eradicating inequality, to which Roland just gestured. Third condition, the event is democratic in the sense that rather than recruiting individuals from special interest groups whose interests it serves, it is open to all, the Pauline gesture of offering salvation to all, whether Greek or Jew. For example, consider a case to which Jacques Rancière draws attention, the radical gesture by Jeanne de Rouen, who stood for legislative election in France at a time, 1849, when women were not legally permitted to be candidates. From Badiou's perspective, this gesture counts as an event, in particular a political event, insofar as subjects in general, men and women, Greek and Jew, interpret and remain faithful to it as a source for a previously indiscernible pattern of effects, which rather than merely advancing the cause of women, breaks down the social boundaries that create inequality. In other words, de Rohan's gesture retrospectively takes on the mantle of a political event through the action of militants who, in the name of equality, remain faithful to it through a series of contingencies, setbacks, diversions, etc., which take it in wholly unexpected, unpredictable, even senseless directions. The danger, of course, is that such fidelity to the event runs out of steam, with the result the spirit of the initial gesture disseminates. Or worse, the gesture itself becomes absolutized, its effects predictable and listed encyclopedically, in which case, to use Rancière's terms, the political impulse reduces to mere policing. It follows that in its very conception, the political is irremediably fragile, ephemeral, always and already in need of renewal through the action of the faithful. Thus, contrary to Zizek's claim, it is clear that for Badiou, the political event does not involve the authoritative introduction of a new master signifier, let alone an intervention by a master in any sort of conventional totalitarian sense of the term. On the contrary, such events are a matter of an always and already open, thoughtful, and in particular self-critical engagement with the present, which seeks to preserve the event, even as, in response to contingencies, diversions and setbacks, the future takes it in new directions that defy any attempt to master its unfolding, thereby continually facing militants who sign on to the event with the challenge of renewing. It is clear that these militants, these political agents, are nothing like masters in Lacan's sense. Instead, they are close to what Foucault calls particular intellectuals, whom Foucault envisages in the following terms. I dream of the intellectual destroyer of universalities, the one who, in the inertias and constraints of the present, locates and marks the weak points, the openings, the lines of force, who incessantly displaces himself, doesn't know exactly where he is heading, nor what he'll think tomorrow, because he's too attentive to the present. Badiou differs from Foucault, then, in emphasizing that as political subjects, such particular intellectuals destroy universalities only as a prelude to the discernment and renewal of a new ordering of equality and justice. Thank you very much.